You've heard this story before. A gifted student on a fateful field trip, an escaped radioactive spider, a single bite, a morning that will change his life, new abilities, a new suit, a new calling, and a tragedy. An uncle bleeding out, an aunt in mourning, a guilty and lost child gifted with amazing abilities, but not enough to save the man he loved as a father. A funeral, friends who tried to be there but were pushed away, a choice to make: justice or vengeance. And 6 words that will change this young man's life. With great power comes great responsibility. You've heard the story of Spider-Man before, again and again and again. But just like any great story that we never truly let die, it's because Peter Parker means something to us. He has something to teach us about the world, about what it means to be a hero, and about ourselves. Today, I'm going to teach you the true origin story of Spider-Man, and why he might just be the greatest superhero of all time. Welcome to Singularity. He's an icon today. Who hasn't heard of Spider-Man? From movies to comics to video games and everywhere in between, Peter Parker is Marvel's golden boy. When they wanted to show how impactful and world-changing the superhuman Civil War was, they did it by having Spider-Man publicly unmask himself. When Secret Wars was shaking up the status quo of the entire Marvel multiverse, one of the headlines was Spider-Man getting a brand new suit. I mean, even his rogues gallery is more iconic than most other superheroes. But in the beginning, the odds were stacked against the now famous webhead. So what happened? Let's rewind. The year was 1962, and the rivalry between the two most famous comic companies of all time was really starting to heat up. DC had recently found a goldmine by introducing teenage superheroes like Robin, Kid Flash, and Aqualad, sidekicks to well-established characters. These protégés were able to reach a new audience and appeal to a younger generation, and Marvel wanted in on the profits. So they asked veteran writer Stan Lee to make a teenage superhero to tap into that market. And he had some big ideas. This wouldn't just be another musclehead in spandex. Lee wanted a hero with a unique power, no more super strength or flight. He wanted a hero who was unpopular, so that he could tackle social issues alongside his fight for justice. But perhaps most importantly, Stan Lee wanted a superhero who would age and grow along with his audience, facing genuine moral struggles as he matured. You can probably already see the underpinnings of the Spider-Man you know and love. And after a few passes with artist Steve Ditko, who, fun fact, originally wanted the costume to be orange and purple instead of blue and red, they had their superhero. He was a new kind of superhero. He wasn't an alien who won the superpower lottery, or a billionaire with endless funds, or a warrior with centuries of training. He was a high school nerd who got bullied by jocks and had girl troubles. He was the kind of character that audiences could look at and say, yeah, he's kind of like me. He was rejected immediately. Publisher Martin Goodman didn't think anyone would want to read about a superhero who wasn't popular. But Lee and Ditko pushed, and they were eventually allowed to publish Spider-Man's story in Amazing Fantasy number 15, an issue that today is iconic, but back then... So Amazing Fantasy was an anthology series that was already on the chopping block, and being given a slot in the last issue of an already cancelled book was basically a death sentence for a new character. But when Goodman realized later that year that Amazing Fantasy number 15 had been one of the best-selling issues, he asked for an ongoing series. The Amazing Spider-Man was born, and it soon became one of the most successful and longest-running series in Marvel history. Spider-Man was a hit. When college students were polled about the most important revolutionary icons, Spider-Man ranked next to Bob Dylan and Che Guevara. One interviewee said that Spider-Man resonated with him so much because he was, quote, beset by woes, money, problems, and the question of existence. In short, he's one of us. Today, Spider-Man's appeared in over 4,000 comics, had 3 dedicated movie franchises, He's been a member of the Avengers, the Defenders, a Horseman of the Apocalypse. He's had multiple massive events where he teamed up with dozens of alternate versions of himself to save the multiverse. No one can deny that Peter Parker is one of the most iconic superheroes of all time. But he's not just popular, he's also important. Because if it weren't for Spider-Man, we might not have comics as we know them today. In 1970, the Nixon administration approached Stan Lee about running a special anti-drugs comic to warn the public about the dangers of substance use. Lee, of course, agreed and wanted Spider-Man to be the vessel for the message. There was just one problem. In 1970, comics were still ruled by the Comics Code Authority, the self-governing body that ensured comics were appropriate for all ages. They had rules like, in every instance good shall triumph over evil and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. Or, scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibals, and werewolfism are prohibited. And a lot more. And drugs were a big no. See, the problem with the code is that it was both too generic to be useful and too unyielding to work around. I mean, how can you rule against any and all depictions of drugs when, technically speaking, Captain America's powers came from a drug? How can you show the criminal world realistically when the criminals have to be thrown in jail at the end of every issue? By the 70s, the Comics Code was outliving its usefulness, but it still had a lot of power. If your issue didn't have that seal of approval on it, a lot of places wouldn't even sell it. So it was time for someone to do something about it. Enter Green Goblin Reborn. Stan Lee penned this story with art by Gil Kane and John Romita Sr., and it was a big departure from the types of stories being told around this time. It centered around Peter dealing with his roommate and best friend Harry Osborn, who had decided to start popping these generic, nameless pills at the same time that his supervillain dad, the Green Goblin, showed up again out of the blue with amnesia. I'll spare you all of the details of this story, but it was certainly a product of its time, with Spider-Man proclaiming to himself at the end, "I would rather face 100 supervillains than throw my life away on hard drugs, because it is a battle you cannot win." It was cheesy, but it was exactly what the government asked for, and it was unpublishable. Sure, there had been a few issues that had come out in previous years that featured drugs. They were never explicitly outlawed, probably to avoid taking a hard stance on the Captain America issue, but it was difficult. Strange Adventures 205 got past the filter because, according to acting co-director John Goldwater, it featured a transaction and not any actual drug usage. But that's a pretty finicky line to draw. If your issue had drugs in it at all, even if it was a message against them, the code would strike it down. You would have to appeal to the acting director, who, at the time that Green Goblin Reborn, Amazing Spider-Man number 96, was sent to them, was on vacation. It was denied because of on-panel use of narcotics, a decision that Stan Lee strongly disagreed with. In a 1988 interview, he said, "I could understand them. They were like lawyers, people who take things literally and technically, so I didn't even get mad at them. I said screw it and just took the code seal off for those 3 issues. Then we went back to the code again. I was aware that young people were reading these books, and had there not been a code, I don't think that I would have done the stories any differently." This was one of the first major publications from the Big Two that lacked that seal since the code's inception. And it was a success. All of the fear that it would bomb because it didn't have the seal was unfounded, as Green Goblin Reborn flew off the shelf and took its place in comic book history. People realized that they didn't need the code anymore, and the types of stories that comics could tell started to evolve. Many issues and storylines were published in the ensuing decades before the CCA imploded, but most comic historians point to this moment, this story, as the key that undercut their authority entirely. Stan Lee and his favorite superhero, Spider-Man, changed the landscape of comic books forever. But he couldn't have done it if he wasn't already a massively popular character. And what makes him so popular? Take a look at Spider-Man's costume. Do you notice anything strange about it? It covers him from head to toe. While many heroes have to obscure themselves somewhat to keep their identity hidden, You don't see too many who are covering everything up like a Puritan. This is something you expect to see on a villain like Doctor Doom or Bane, obscuring their humanity, their relatability. For Spider-Man, though, it has a different effect. Comics theorist and author of the amazing book Understanding Comics, Scott McCloud, points out that the more obscure a face is, the more relatable it is. This can only be Founding Father George Washington. But this? Well, that's just a smiley face. It could be almost anyone. And when we can't see anything about who Spider-Man really is, well, he could be almost anyone. And that matters. Studies have shown time and time again that representation makes a difference. Being able to look at heroes that we can see ourselves in inspires us to be the hero inside. That's who Spider-Man is. He's the best part of all of us. With great power comes great responsibility was a phrase originally uttered by a nameless narrator, but Sam Raimi chose to give those words to Uncle Ben instead. It's not a new sentiment. The Gospel of Luke records Jesus saying, "From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked." William Lamb, a member of British Parliament, said in 1817, "The possession of great power necessarily implies great responsibility." President William McKinley, in his 1899 State of the Union address, closed by saying, "Presented to this Congress are great opportunities. With them come great responsibilities." This principle, this philosophical call to action, resonates with us. One of my favorite examples is the concept of noblesse oblige. It's a French expression that means nobility goes beyond status. If one is truly noble, they will make decisions that benefit others. They'll be held to a higher standard. Whoever claims to be noble must conduct himself nobly. With great power comes great responsibility. It's a call to action. Because what does it mean to have great power? If you have the power to save the world, it becomes your responsibility to do so. If you have the power to shape laws for the benefit of society, you are expected to do so responsibly. But if the most power you have is to help someone who's fallen on hard times, provide an encouraging word to someone when they're having a bad day, to make someone's life a little bit better, a little bit at a time, are you any less responsible to do so? Spider-Man has always been a little fish in a very big pond. Some of his best stories are the ones where he's outmatched, overpowered, beaten down. But he gets back up. He always gets back up. Peter Parker has had the odds stacked against him from the very beginning. That's never stopped him from helping an old lady across the street or getting a cat out of a tree. In 2018, the movie Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse hit theaters. It was a game changer, innovating not only the way comics could be adapted to a screen, but the field of CGI storytelling in its entirety. But the biggest impact of that movie was something much simpler. It introduced mainstream audiences of the world for the first time ever to a black Spider-Man, to a female Spider-Man, to an Asian Spider-Man, to a middle-aged and burnt-out Spider-Man, to a Spider-Man who failed and failed and failed again and got back up every time. And that well only grows. There's a whole Spider-Verse out there of ordinary people making the world a better place, in whatever small ways that they can, one day at a time. That mask had always been a symbol, inspiring each of us to be the best we could be. But now it takes on a whole new meaning. Anyone can be Spider-Man, be a hero. Anyone who has the opportunity to lend a helping hand or to be the best part of someone else's worst day. That's what makes Spider-Man so great. He inspires us to be great. We've been telling his story for decades. In a way, Stan Lee got his wish. Generations have gotten to see Peter Parker grow up and mature alongside them. And for generations to come, we'll continue to watch Peter and Miles and Gwen and all of the others choose every day to rise to the responsibility placed upon them. And every day you'll be given an opportunity, some modicum of power, no matter how great or small. You may not be able to outmuscle Galactus or go toe-to-toe with an omnipotent space whale, but you still have the power to change the world a little bit at a time. And with great power comes great responsibility. What choice will you make? This is Singularity, and remember to stay curious.